I mean, for the really, really diehard, long-time followers of your channel, I should out myself as the woodshed friend. Take you out to the
Yes.
woodshed friend. That was probably 2 years ago, so most people probably won't remember it. But when you were first talking about estuary,
You forced my estuary hand.
yeah, we had one of our many conversations. Yeah, so maybe I'll just kind of start at the beginning of how you and I came to know each other, and that kind of might lead us into something fruitful. So, well, I'm not sure when it was exactly that I started noticing. If you picked pretty much any major pillar of modern life, all the big stuff, how we educate our children, how we heal our sick, how we take care of our elderly, how we find a mate, what even work is, like how we work, all of the sort of the big fundamental pillars of what might make for something like a good life. If you were to take any one of them and, just start from scratch, if you are going to design like the optimal approach to that particular subject, would you do anything like the way we do it now? Right. And that's kind of just a kind of a worldview, was just kind of standing back from things and going like, how on earth did we end up doing it like this? Right. And so that's kind of informed a lot of the ways I look at things. And particularly, and this is kind of how I ended up stumbling across Jordan Peterson, and then of course, like so many, stumbling across you, I was particularly interested in, and this is now probably at least 10 years ago, talk to my friends, I was talking about this a lot, this sort of obviously deteriorating state of affairs between the relations between men and women. And it was something that it was just it seemed so obvious to me, and yet it seemed like it was one of those things that was kind of hiding in plain sight. People just weren't really talking about it. And then along comes, kind of indirectly, this YouTube phenomenon who's, well, talking openly about it and lots of other things. And so that's actually how I stumbled across Jordan Peterson. And then of course, that's how I stumbled across you. And another thing that I noticed, and this was something that was happening right around the same time that I discovered you, a good friend of mine who had a very successful therapy practice, couples counseling primarily, decided to close her practice, kind of when it was full, at the peak of it. And I remember having a couple conversations with her. And at one point I said, like, why did you do that? It seemed like, she had a waiting list for crying out loud. And her blunt answer was, I'm just not sure that I'm helping people. And first of all, the amazing candor to share something like that, and also the kind of courage to walk away from a steady income and not just sort of go through the motions, always really stuck with me. And then I come across a Christian pastor who's out there on the internet, entertaining all kinds of questions that, at least in my experience, it wasn't what I would have expected from a pastor. Whether or not there are others that do what you do, fair enough. I wasn't meeting them. And it surprised me in the sense that it seemed like you were acknowledging maybe you didn't have all the answers either, at minimum. And so then what prompted this conversation, this particular conversation, is I texted you a week or so ago because you'd had a conversation with John Vervaeke. And here I see, a tenured professor within the academy having a conversation with a third generation Christian pastor, and you're having a conversation about having 1 foot in and 1 foot out of the institutions. And of course, what prompted my little text to you is like, oh, well, as it happens, accidentally, I've sort of spent a lot of my life starting things. Whether they become institutions or not, I suppose will come after I'm not here anymore. But it just occurred to me that I'm noticing a lot of people who we might have given the authority to tell us the way forward, many of them are having doubts about, or at least entertaining doubts about, whether or not what they're doing is quote unquote working? Is it leading the way, right? And I'm going to weave in a lot of things here, but you might argue that the election of Donald Trump for a lot of people was something like, how could this possibly happen? This idea that where are the adults that would somehow, have headed this off before it got to that kind of question, and this kind of gradual deterioration of almost every institution, every sort of source of authority, credibility, source of hope, source of guidance, source of meaning. Maybe that leads us to the meaning crisis. And so that's a very brief summary of how I found myself to you. And then I've been basically following ever since. I've been watching, and sometimes you don't know exactly why you take an interest in something, because it's not obvious exactly why I found what you were doing so interesting. That's not in any way a comment on how interesting it is or is not. It's just, sometimes you don't really know why you find something interesting. So that's a quick kind of, that's my version of, I suppose what I should add is that, and we talked about this a little bit when you came on our little project. I like to tune in, like when some coincidence happens, it's like, that's just too random. I like to sort of tune into that frequency. Anytime something happens, that's just like, what are the chances of that, right? I sort of make a point of paying attention to that. And very early, I forget, one of your early videos, you mentioned Whitensville, which, this is a tiny little town that almost nobody's ever heard of in what is sort of, it's kind of in the middle of Massachusetts. What happens to be the town that my father was born and grew up in. And I think we since figured out that your mom and my dad probably went to secondary school together. Although we should check that out because she's still alive. We could actually find out.
We should. I should ask her.
And I know you've rented a car from my uncle who has a business there. It's just this tiny little town in kind of Nowheresville. It's gradually getting kind of the spread of Boston is gradually encroaching it as well, but just kind of a farming community, but has this very interesting history of Mr. Whiten and his Whiten Machine Works. And I now know all the Christian Reform folks that ended up coming over as a result of that. This is all stuff that I didn't know, along with all the other things that I didn't know until I encountered you. Like, honestly, I really didn't know the difference between, really a Protestant and a Catholic, barely, barely. I certainly didn't know the difference between a Methodist and a Presbyterian and a Baptist, and all of these distinctions that seem really salient, at least to some people. These are all things that I have learned from sort of following your journey. So that's a quick sort of summary and setup, and we can sort of go anywhere you want with this.
Well, that was really good. I think that was a terrific. In fact, I thought a really good, not only intro into our relationship and how we met and what we've been talking about for the last few years, but also into this moment. The YouTube algorithm for me pulled up a local TV station's capturing of, it was either local or Southern California, of Gavin Newsom talking about how he woke up in the morning and saw the leak of the Supreme Court Roe v. Wade thing and said, I thought this was, coming from The Onion. And I thought, well, isn't that exactly the experience that we've been having for the last half decade or more? So Trump was elected in 2016. That wasn't supposed to happen. There's a lot of things, we now have a land war in Europe. That wasn't supposed to happen. Now, obviously, people looking at longer patterns say, oh, did you think that we had done away with war? And if you know a little bit of history, that was 100 years ago. That was the thinking at the end of this
to end all wars. Yeah,
exactly. We grew up with that, the war to end all wars, but I never sat down and thought, oh, they were serious. And I was just this morning listening to The Rest is History, Operation Barbarossa, where Tom Holland has his brother on the podcast. And I've done, I was a World War II buff as a kid and a teenager, because that was the biggest deal when I was growing up in the early 60s, at least. By the time you get to the 70s, the 60s were a big deal. But, you know, he made the point that Hitler didn't plan to start World War II. He planned a bunch of limited military operations in order to achieve certain objectives that he had for Germany. He didn't plan to start World War II, but he did. And so when Gavin Newsom, you know, says, well, the overturning of Roe v. Wade is, he didn't say it this way, but that's like the election of Donald Trump. History, we had a plan about how history was supposed to go. We had the answers, and this wasn't on it. So up, setback, let's turn around and undo it, and then we'll keep going forward. And, you know, you're commenting about this therapist. I fairly early on, I met a therapist who from one of the different estuaries in California. And he, you know, he told me, his expression to me about the efficacy of his work, he just rolled his eyes, because he thought, I'm not really doing anything for these people. Well, that's a terribly frightening thing, given the fact that one of the things that happened in the 20th century was that a mass of different things sort of supplanted the church, and therapy supplanted what had been pastoral care, church care for the soul. Therapy was supposed to offer solutions. And I'm not saying that therapy isn't appropriate or therapy doesn't work for some people. There are still people around me that could use a good psychologist, but this bigger change, and that, you know, in all honesty, I think the church has to be honest that lots of church things stopped working too. And pastors will admit that to each other. But like you're not going to have the, you know, Professional Association of American Therapists, or whatever they call themselves, admit that, you know, you've got an institutional facade to maintain. And so when Gavin Newsom says, I thought this was from the Onion, how could it be that Roe v. Wade would be overturned? And even all of the discussions from both sides, that, you know, I'm thinking, all right, well, so that means that if in fact this does happen, depending of course on all the details, state legislatures will have more authority to determine, you know, what legal doctoral assisted abortion looks like in America. But when you listen to people talking about it on Twitter, no, it's black, white, good, evil, it's everything. And then, I mean, the element that you introduced that you know I have talked about, that has been a big piece of the conversation, has been men and women can't find each other, both kind of literally, but also find each other in the way that they have been told will complete them. And that goes far beyond rates of marriage and divorce. It goes far beyond, you know, replacement levels and fertility. It goes beyond, it touches on a lot of things. And so if there's a frontier that humanity has always lived with, and for whom our institutions and solutions have never really, have clearly never finally resolved. It's the relationship between men and women.
I was having a conversation years ago. I remember maybe 10 years ago, with a friend. She's a college professor, and somehow the subject of the a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle.
Yeah.
One of the essays one of the many essays I'll probably never write is something like fish seeks bicycle. Because I said, well, fair enough, right? I mean, if you look around, you see a lot of evidence. That was when there was like a lot of columns coming out, like the end of men. Remember this? You know, there was like, this is the kind of, it was out there, it was kind of in the water. And I said, okay, what if the single most powerful force within many, if not most, if not all men, that causes him to fall in love with her is the sense that she needs him? Now what? If you take it as a given that most, if not all, men have somewhere asleep within them a sleeping giant, a hero. There's a moment where suddenly he's 10 feet tall. He can move mountains. He can do anything. Suddenly he squares his shoulder and leans into the wind, and he's doing it for her, for that smile he got, right? Now what? Fair enough. He's no longer needed. I liked that little snippet that you had recently where Joey was talking about, because it's funny, because almost the exact wording I use. I would say, like, you know, if you ever, like, what advice do you give young men today? I'd say be useful. Find something. If you look around, actually almost everywhere you look, there's something, right? There's need everywhere. If you know how to look for it, you'll find it. There's almost in every domain, there's need. And so find something and get good at that and be useful. It was interesting that he had a similar kind of line of thinking, because I agree with that. But as more and more of those domains are being, not only a lot of these positions, not only are they being held by women, women are doing it better. That's the reality, right? Is that there's so many ways in which, so many aspects of modern life where women, frankly, do it better than men do. I sort of like to joke that there might be only 3 or 4 things that men are better at than women, plus or minus 3. You know, there aren't that many things, right? So you better get good at least 1 or 2 of those. And so the idea that we're going to have to essentially renegotiate some new arrangement, some new way of relating to each other that's mutually satisfying. There's the word satisfaction. Probably get to that too. You gotta find a way to create a mutually satisfying relationship. And if you just imagine the mindset you have to be in to stand up in front of all your friends and family, and maybe in front of a priest or a rabbi or a justice of the peace, or at least somebody who went online and got ordained to accomplish it. If you're going to stand in front of everyone who you know and love and declare, this is my public choice in a woman, this is my public choice in a man, just imagine the state that your heart has to be in to be that open, that vulnerable, that trusting, that willing to compromise, that willing to make sacrifices. What exactly are you doing it for? In service of what, right? What is the end that you seek? It's a massive question. And you know, what we see a lot of young people deciding is like, it's just a shrug. They're like an eye roll and a shrug, and they shuffle off the battlefield. And to me, that's a very sad state of affairs.
Yeah. No, I thought Joey said it very well. And Joey has, you know, he was also a participant in the marriage handoff, or lack of generational handoff, that we've been having. And, you know, the first, you know, what you mentioned earlier, this, you know, the way that we do things, you know, if we were to design this, why on earth, you know, we'd never do it this way if we were to design it. Yet the generations that we have received from, they very much inherited what they had received. And part of the vision of rationality that sort of grabbed the microphone of the culture in New Atheism was straightforward, rational intentionality to achieve outcomes that we can all agree are preferable. And that is the hope. When most of humanity has been navigating, navigating would seem to not be the right word for exactly how humans make their way into the future. All these little efforts to, some one group is pursuing this, one group is pursuing that, one group is pursuing that. And all along the way, it's like one of my favorite lines from the Peterson classroom lectures, when I was going through all of those in 2016, 2017, whenever that was, he said, what is a car? I thought a car was something that's going to get me between here and the grocery store, or to bring my kid to school or something like that. A car is a way to reorganize cities in America. I grew up on one coast where cities predated cars, and that's evident looking at the map. And now I'm living on another coast where car predates city. So we have these broad boulevards and you can't walk anywhere, et cetera, et cetera. The atmosphere has been changed by cars partially, or at least the internal combustion engine. So it's hardly the case that we are navigating our way into the future, that Gavin Newsom says, well, I know how the future is going to work. It's going to go like this. I'd be a little careful about those kinds of statements.
It depends on how you use the word navigate. I see what you're saying, but this is too good an opportunity. What is a car? Too good an opportunity to ask questions that I've been wanting to ask you, which is, what exactly is a church? Because it seems to me that the atheist argument would only, quote unquote, work. It's essentially a deconstruction argument, right? It would only work if it at least kind of rang true, right? There's a way in which the salience of that argument, particularly when it happened, and the reason why they got the kind of attention they did and the platforms they did, was because they were saying a lot of things that sounded true to a lot of people, that resonated with a lot of people, right? So, and you know this, but for the purpose of this conversation, I live in Nashville now, born and raised in Southern California. But in one of these neighborhoods that was a traditionally Black neighborhood, and on this street there are still 6 or 7 Black families, but little by little, it's a neighborhood that's becoming gentrified. Nashville's one of those cities that every time I tell people I'm from California, I always feel like I should apologize. I came here before all the rest of them did, so at least a little bit before most of them did. But watching within 10 blocks in either direction, there are probably at least 12 to 15 churches. It's extraordinary how many churches there are on every corner, mid-block, little ones, big ones. And you can imagine 50 years ago what Sunday morning must have looked like in this neighborhood as people put on their finest and walked to church, and how much a part of this community these churches were, and the sense of community. And then one by one, they're knocking them down. And I think I sent you a video of one of them. It was just tragic to watch the wrecking ball, literally shatter you could see inside the sanctuary as the walls came tumbling down. And I'm not even sure exactly why I feel sad, but I know I feel sad when I watch that, right? And now there's townhouses going up. One of them is going to be preserved. I think, some people came to their senses and said, before maybe we should at least try to preserve some of these more historic spaces. So the new one of them looks like it's going to become some kind of private school. But you often say something about your dying church, something you've been saying almost since the beginning. It's always stuck with me, like that particular phrase. Besides seeming, I've got the fixer in me. I'm like, well, let's fix it. There's got to be something. Anytime I hear something's broken or struggling, my first instinct, well, what can we do about it? And it feels a little pessimistic or fatalistic to me somehow. But getting to know you and having visited, I've been out to Living Stones, and I've spent a little time some of your meetups and gotten to know you a little bit. I see what you mean, right? But what is a church if it can die, right? There's a sense anyway that if an institution is healthy and thriving, that at least it's able to sustain itself, and perhaps even grow, right? So, and this is a kind of a branch to the conversation, like, well, what makes a Methodist exactly? These are obviously distinctions that matter to somebody at some point. I mean, in some cases, people killed each other over these distinctions, right? Yet now it feels more like a franchise. Like the people who go to that particular denomination, do they know why they go to that particular denomination? Is it just because it's nearby, or where that's where all the cool people go, or where the young people go, or they like the music, or what exactly is a church?
And when we say church, do we mean this thing here on Florin Road? Do we mean the particular denomination, the Dutch Calvinist CRC group? Do we mean, it scales up, the church. There's been a fight about this for 500 years, because Luther basically said, well, the true church is invisible. And of course, the Catholics and the Orthodox say, you see, there's your problem. And so in many ways, I am on YouTube because I'm seeking the answer to this. And yeah, I could talk a lot about
one of your best qualities, by the way.
What?
One of your absolute best qualities, in my opinion.
Last Sunday we had 6 people here that would never have been in this room if were not for YouTube. And that was kind of a big number. It's especially post-COVID, it's a small group that's here on Sundays. And regularly people will say to me, well, if I lived in Sacramento, I would definitely go to your church. And I always think, you have no idea. You have no idea what life looks like on the ground here. And you'll get a better idea if you watch the Freddie and Paul show, and maybe in that and the Sunday school, but probably the Freddie and Paul show will give you a better idea about what's on the ground here than almost anything else that's on my channel. Yeah. I was talking to, well, this was in my conversation with John about the decay of all of our institutions and our authorities. The temple was, I'm a lover of The Rest is History. I'm a friend of the show. The Esagila in Babylon is the first city, or is the first building, and it's the house of the god. And then right outside the house of the god, you always have the altar, which is the way to communicate with the god. And it's out of this which will grow, monarchy, government. This is the seed out of which all of civilization grows. Civilization, Kiwitas. This is the seed out of which all of this grows. And part of what makes America strange is that with the exception of some places in New England that both you and I can name names of and very clearly picture in our heads, where when the Puritans came over, you'd have the common, and in Boston still, Park Street Congregational is right on the Boston Common. And so New England organized its villages around the center, around the seed, but most of our cities have long since, you have your downtown area, New York City, you have the Battery, in which was, of course, the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers. Now you have the Freedom Tower. You have Wall Street. These are the centers of cities. Many places in the Midwest, you'll have, Allentown, you'll have steelworks. Houston, you have oil. Nashville, you have music. So the church as the center of civilization has obviously been distressed. And the pastor as basically the someone to help curate the story, and story scales like church. There's your story, there's our little story, there's the family story. I mean, it goes all the way out to history, the one big story. And so as a pastor, we did notice that as late as the 1950s, when there'd be major think tanks in American culture to discuss the state of the civilization. There would always be a seat at the table for the clergy. Once the 60s happened, in some ways, the music industry, the film industry sort of pushed out the clergy. And so we are sort of like heavy industry in Ohio and Pennsylvania. And we're sort of lingering around the edges, and you'll still get a pastor praying at the inaugural because that's the liturgy. But even Barack Obama had Rick Warren because he called Rick Warren America's pastor. That was in 2008. But by 2012, no Democrat would have a pastor who wasn't, for example, affirming of same-sex marriage on a podium. And at this point, probably Republicans would think twice about it too, despite what's going on in terms of their base. So talking about these things and conceptualizing these things, I think demonstrates both, the point that the new atheists made and why their hegemony was so short-lived, because it's too large for us to simply conceptualize the dramatic changes that have happened. And it's easy, and this is, so obviously I'm a Christian minister. I'm from a moderate to conservative denomination, but I don't know that there's any going back again, because as a seed gives way to the plant, it no longer looks like the seed. And plants undergo all kinds of changes and developments as they grow. There is a sense in which the little tree does look like the big tree, but depending on the type of tree, there'll be leaves that get shed, and there'll be limbs that get dropped, and there'll be knots. And so we're trying to discern the tree now and understand what is the church and where does it fit in?
The term disenchantment has been used a lot in this kind of longing for a kind of re-enchantment. There's a couple different ways that what you say makes me want to go, but for a second to kind of loop back to that idea of, you know, church shopping, right? I go where all the young people, like, you know, if I'm fascinated by all the people who lose interest in church as they, you know, into their teen years and early adulthood, and then there's a point where they start a family and they said, oh, maybe we should get back to church, you know, want to raise them in the right environment, which sounds to me like you're saying church is good for kids. Sort of an interesting instinct, but that does seem to be a point where a lot of people take interest again, and then they go shopping, and they try to find a church that feels like a good fit. We probably even encourage them to do that. I think you probably do, right? But there's something about something that you picked that makes it almost impossible to be enchanted by, because you chose it. You're the agent. You decided. It's not that different than finding your future spouse on Tinder. You know, you have a catalog and you can flip through the pages. Remember those? And you can pick a picture you like and you can say that's the one, and you can design your life. There's something about when we decided that we don't fully trust our choice. We even if we did meet that way, we might be tempted to come up with a shared story between us, like, well, we'll tell people we met through mutual friends or whatever. Well, why do we have that instinct? You know, why are some origin stories better than others? Probably because they have some sort of sense of providence about them, like, well, it was fate, or it was, right, there was some reason. And so I've seen this kind of idea of unchosen relationships floating around a bit in the Twitterverse. That the sort of the liberal project was to give us the full freedom to, well, navigate our life based on the choices that are consistent with our preferences, our values, or whatever, right? And who's against that? Who could possibly be against that? Certainly not me. I'd probably be pretty reluctant to give up most of the freedoms that I have living in this country. On the other hand, if the only relationships you have are ones that quote unquote work for you, then why on earth would you take on the, you know, the burden of, you know, well, going to a church where people annoy you or whatever, right? Or there are too many old people, whatever, right? It seems to me that this ability to design your life runs right up against this idea of being enchanted by things that are sort of outside of your control. I don't have an answer to that exactly, but it does seem to me that there's something seems off to me when someone says, well, we went shopping for a church and we found the one we liked and that's where we go now. And I'm thinking, so that sounds an awful lot like a club of people of mutual interest or something, right? And again, I'm not saying that that's a bad thing exactly, but I don't know. It's jarring because I have these ideas of what I think a church is, and that just doesn't sound right to me.
Well, church. Freddie keeps calling me now because we got to go get a bus pass today. And if I had to choose the way I wanted to spend my day, it would not include going and picking Freddie up and taking him to the regional transit and standing in line there and making sure that he has the right documents and getting his bus pass. But that's what you do when
you're making my case, right?
Exactly. And what you say
God
is,
bless you for it, by the way.
Well, you know, and I've just eliminated any jewels in heaven by making it public, which is a deep irony of my life. The more you want to share something to say two things. On one hand, yeah, is it an annoyance to is is human community an annoyance? Are human beings annoying?
You bet.
By all means, sometimes worse than annoying, but also delightful. And again, there's one person that will often comment on the Freddie and Paul show. He'll say, this is the heart of the channel. And he's right, because the channel, the Freddie and Paul show, was in some ways the seed out of which the channel grew. And, you know, it's for all the thinky talky stuff that we do with PhDs and randos and what have you, human relationships come down to the deep bonds that we have with people with whom we have mutual need. And, you know, Freddie's need for me involves bus passes and attention and all kinds of things. And I think part of the asymmetry that we have, that we, I think, are getting aware of with what you raised initially in terms of our need to be needed, is that Freddie does things for me which I need, but perhaps don't always want. And churches do that. Families do that. Spouses do that. Children do that. Aging parents do that. And there is a richness in those relationships. You know, Enchanted is a funny thing, because every story of enchantment involves, any good story of enchantment involves suffering. You're not going to get enchantment without suffering, whether it's something that needs to be overcome or something that needs to be endured, or it's the suffering that is in pursuit of some surprising glory that emerges. So C.S. Lewis's mentor of sorts, George MacDonald, has this really cool fairy tale of a little girl who discovers one day that up in the attic of her house is a stairway and a room she had no knowledge of, and a grandmother that she had no knowledge of. And her grandmother is magical and enchanted and, you know, has powers. And there are all these evil creatures, these goblins and things. And it's funny, goblins in his stories, but the grandmother basically gives her a ring and says, when you get in trouble, you have to follow the thread. And of course, the goblins are out there, and chaos is all over the place. And she's met this young boy who seems to be the answer to everything. And she realizes that the ring is attached to a thread, and all she can do, you can hardly see the thread, but you can feel it. And so she follows the thread, and she's hoping that it will hit the stairs that go up to her magical grandmother, who's going to be able to take care of the trolls. But to her shock and alarm, the thread heads towards the mountain where the goblins come out of. And so she has to go towards the danger, and then she has to go under the ground. And then she keeps following the thread, and the thread goes to a wall underground in the goblin kingdom. And she's in, my grandmother's all, what do I think of my grandmother? Why did she do this to me? And then she gets all the way to the wall, and to discover that the prince, he's not a prince, he's a miner's son, is trapped on the other side of the wall, and she needs to work with him to break down the wall. And of course, there's no instant solution there, but I got clued onto this because Tim Keller kept using this illustration in a sermon. You have to follow the thread, and the thread almost always goes where you don't want to go. Now, of course, Jordan Peterson fans will hear all kinds of things in this, but that is, in fact, this ancient wisdom that says your choices are not exactly what you think. And, I've been watching getting little tidbits of the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial that's been going on. And, it doesn't matter when you tune in almost any moment, you can see both of these two just throwing each other's dirty laundry out into the public. And you would say, here's this enormously talented, charismatic man who was the desire of, so many women. And you have this beautiful woman who was the desire of so many men, and they had money and wealth and fame. And at one point they stood together and said, I will love you to the day I die. And not too many years after, they are trying to throw everything at each other. And okay, maybe now we can have a little bit of humility and say, maybe I don't know so much.
You might say that they lost their faith.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, if that's another fantastic, rich vein of conversation topic, because it's, well, if nothing else, what, tens of millions of people are Googling borderline personality disorder. Right? We're learning.
Yeah.
It's obviously extremely painful when love fails, but you learn from it. And we're all getting to watch that, very sad for the two of them. But in a sense, the value of what's being learned by everyone who's watching this. If nothing else, the idea, how many teenage boys, grow up thinking, she's so beautiful. If I could just have her, then everything would be perfect. Right? Just the juxtaposition of a beautiful face with the audio of what that face is capable of when angry. Yeah. But I wanted to stay on the enchanted thing for a little bit longer, because I just love that subject. It's funny that Jonathan Fajot, one of his early videos he did on Santa Claus, because when I was in high school, I had a little regular column in the high school paper, and one of my columns was, of course, Santa Claus exists, right? And it was something like, well, what are you talking about? I mean, go to the mall. There he is again. Like he's everywhere, right? What do you mean he doesn't exist? He obviously exists, And it was just kind of a lighthearted thing. But I was playing with an idea at the time. That what do you mean by, is he real, right? And I love this sort of little vignette, like a little scene from a movie where you've got, say, let's say 4 generations of one family who are all gathered together around the tree on Christmas morning. And the way this family is structured, you've got the great grandparents and grandparents and parents, and you've got the children, and there's only one child who's 6, who doesn't yet know, let's say, the truth about Santa Claus, and everyone has conspired to make sure that the child has the experience that Santa Claus is real. And so there's like a half-eaten cookie by the fireplace with a little bit of milk left over, and there's reindeer marks in the snow on the roof, and Uncle Joe plays Santa, and the whole family's in on it, right? And even the older kids, they already know, but they keep playing along just to protect this one child. And let's say fast forward a year later, and now that child is 7, and in the intervening year, well, now she knows. But the scene is exactly the same. They're still doing exactly the same thing, right? And Uncle Joe died of a heart attack last year, so now it's Uncle Jim who plays Santa, and everyone's just a year older, and now no one believes in Santa. But if you were a reporter or something like that, you showed up with a microphone and you're asking questions, you're going around poking around and asking, so maybe you went to the great grandparents, and there they are watching in all of its glory, that their legacy played out in front of them, all the memories, the children, the grandchildren, the great grandchildren, and you say something like, so ma'am, do you believe in Santa Claus? And then just the twinkle in her eye as she, what do you mean, do I believe in Santa Claus, right? So like, it seems to me that like we're always playing with these ideas that we're whatever makes it enchanting, almost as soon as we try to control it, as soon as we try to say, well, that's enchanted, then it no longer is enchanted. And in a sense, that's kind of my beef with a lot of theology. It's like you're ruining it. You're trying to explain it. You're trying to make it into a formula. And as soon as you do that, now you've tainted it, right? You've changed it by trying to make it make sense in some way. And I managed to skip over the part where you make everybody tell their story. Nice of you not to force me to do it, but I feel like just sort of out of respect for your show, I should at least say a little bit about how I come to this conversation. So I literally learned to read on the Bible. Raised in a very strict fundamentalist, very Bible-based, I guess a home church-based, Christian sect. I frankly, it still exists. I left it as soon as I left home, so I haven't had much to do with it ever since. But part of the reason I left it as soon as I could is because when I turned 18, it was like a cloud of dust, and I was out of there, and I was no longer interested. It was a very unusual way to grow up, particularly in the 70s, surrounded by skateboarders and surfers. And here we were before breakfast every morning. My dad would get up with all four of us and read the Bible with us before breakfast, and then walk to school with us. And this sort of juxtaposition of 45 minutes later from sounding out so and so begets so and so begets so and so, suddenly I'm surrounded by skateboarders, and it was quite an unusual way to grow up. And frankly, as a kid, I hated it because I just wanted to be normal like all the other kids, and that was hard to do in those circumstances. But now at my age, I'm almost your age, I realize how much I'm marinated in those stories. Like they're all there, and now I can kind of even the subject we started talking about earlier. The trouble between men and women. You see a story that says God creates the heaven and earth, and then He creates Adam, and then He creates Eve, and then the trouble starts. It's like you can almost see the ancient Israelites attempting to make sense of something that was obviously so vexing even then. And to have a story that explained it. So that's kind of my background when I, as I know but just to put a little frame around how I'm coming at this conversation. So essentially, it seems to me that the meaning crisis is something like disenchantment across every domain. Like we know too much, right? Think about something like the camera, media, our capacity to watch each other watching each other, right? Even social media in the way, like, I remember the first time I used, I guess it was Skype, the first one of these that I used. And I'd never had the experience of like seeing myself while I was talking to somebody else, like something as basic as that, right? It's like, when would you have done that in any other time in history? Maybe like if you were on the phone and like, we're looking at yourself in a mirror or something. Like, how would you even do that?
Who would do that?
Right.
I'm gonna watch myself talk on the phone.
And then suddenly you can actually see how you're coming across. So you're not just watching their reactions, you're watching your own. And then introduce social media, and now you have everyone watching each other, right? And children are coming into the world now where FaceTime with grandmas is totally normal, right? And I don't think it's an accident that the guy who invented the camera, the very first camera, the very first photo ever taken was a selfie. I mean, it makes sense in a way, right? You're like trying it out. Right? So, but the kind of, if the story of the fall is an allegory for self-consciousness, well, we're now living in a world where we're all hyper self-conscious. Like we're constantly seeing how we're coming across and how we're being received and how others, right? And we're watching their reactions, right? And the optimist in me says this is probably in the long run a positive, right? It's some kind of like up leveling of consciousness or something, right? But in the meantime, it's like if human beings need something to believe in, and we kind of don't really believe it if we can see our fingerprints all over it, right? We need it to be something that like we didn't engineer or control. In other words, we need to be enchanted in some way. Something that sort of lifts our gaze above the horizon and makes us think beyond our own lifetimes, for example. I want to live in a society where old men plant trees under whose shade they will never sit, right? Well, why would anybody do that, right? They have to believe in something. If we've just demystified and disenchanted everything, then what, right? And it seems to me that that's something like another way of describing the meaning crisis. And then we watch ourselves instrumentalize everything we do, right? So even the institutions, well, once there's status to be gained, or once it becomes a profession, being a pastor is a profession. You get degrees that say you know what you're doing, right? And you bring that piece of paper to prospective employers. And well, now to some extent you've been captured, right? And the ways in which that either increases your status or lowers your status, or increases your income or lowers your income. If pastors start with a small church, but everyone knows they're looking for a bigger market, right? Like, I mean, everywhere you look, we're watching ourselves instrumentalize everything. And it seems to me that the only answer to that is something like you said earlier. People can be really disappointed. And now we're watching everybody be disappointing at scale. And shockingly, we've lost our faith in each other. So it seems to me the only answer to that is we've got to find ways to restore our faith in each other. Something like that.
The dance of enchantment is very interesting in a church, because most of the people who come to church come regularly. Used to be they came every week. And in Catholic churches where you have daily mass, they come every day. And in a place like Whitensville, Massachusetts, there are a good number of Catholics that neither you nor I grew up with, but who went every day. And well, so that's one group that are in church, but often the other group that comes into church is looking for a miracle. And they're, and so then, if they're introverts, they'll just sit and listen and maybe pray and maybe hope that they'll just come in, stay under the radar, get out. Maybe boom, a miracle will come. If they're extroverts, they'll stay until after the service and then they'll grab me and okay, I'm looking for my miracle. Let's deliver it. And it's like,
wow, on demand.
Hate to disappoint you. I'll certainly pray for you and we'll certainly ask for it. But do you understand the definition of a miracle? Do you understand what the word means? I think you're very right on enchantment and our fingerprints. We don't believe anything that we have our fingerprints all over, but we're as creatures, we're caught in this trap that we have trust issues, and rightly so. And that story in the garden is on one hand, a story of the rise of self-consciousness. On the other hand, it's also the story of an inability to trust, because that's exactly what the serpent says to the man and the woman. And it's exactly the motivation that, let's say, God number one and God number two, the universe, if you're post-Christian. The universe has it out for you. It's withholding. It's got good stuff that it's keeping from you. And if you take this fruit, it'll be the key to open that door, and you can have access to the special reserve, the VIP access, the insider information, how many different things. And so we've been pursuing that, which is exactly why we want to know where babies come from, and we want to know why plants grow, and we want to know why Amber is hitting on Johnny. And once we have something like borderline personality disorder, oh, well, that explains it. So on one hand, we long for disenchantment. We almost demand it because we need it. At the same time, there's that moment when the child is in on the conspiracy. Well, guess what? Mom went and bought the gifts. So we'd always go up to Whitensville for Christmas, and my cousin, then I'd get to see my cousin about my same age. We'd get to see what he got for Christmas. And he got some GI Joes, and I'm just looking at he had 5 brothers and sisters. So, and his father was doing quite well in the fuel oil business. And I made a comment one year about, well, look at all this stuff. And my cousin told me, Mom doesn't have to pay for it. She just goes to Baker's and says, charge it. And so there's a Baker's is this magical store where Gladdy can just go in and say, charge it. And it's a store where you don't need any money. It's just the word of Gladdy that, brings G.I. Joe and puts him under the tree. And so there's that moment of disenchantment when I told my mother that, she laughed. She just laughed.
I just have to insert here, because of course anybody who's been to that part of the world knows exactly what you're talking about. But I remember when I was arguing with my cousins about their accents, I'd say, when we see an R, we say an R, right? And they says, yeah, so do we. When we see an I, we say an I. You pack the car.
So we're caught in this bind where on one hand, part of what Johnny and Amber, their specific misery is that, yeah, the enchantment is gone. And all of those quirky, creative, magical things about, talk about magical. Who's more magical than Johnny Depp, Edward Scissorhands, and Jack Sparrow, and Willy Wonka? He's been the magical actor. And what's more enchanting for a man than the beauty of an outrageously beautiful woman? And we just, on one hand, we long to live in the enchantment. On the other hand, enchantment is to be, well, we long to worship, but and so here we are. And your point about theology is well taken. But at the same time, Moses, what does Moses want? Moses wants to see the face of God. And God says, no, that I can't show you, but I'll put you in the cleft of the rock. And, we'll go back to back, and I'll announce my name. Yet at other places Moses goes up onto Sinai, and, his face comes down and he's glowing, and Israel finds that so disturbing, he has to wear a veil. And then, but there's, again, there's 2 traditions. The other tradition is he found the fact that the glow was diminishing over time, that, he didn't want to be seen as losing the enchantment. We want to be enchanted, but we want to have it in our grasp.
Yeah. Mostly just as an aside, because it's kind of its own rabbit trail, but possibly quantum physics will give us a way to once again have something that where we are confronted with our inability to grasp, right? Hopefully. It always astounds me, like we talk about science versus religion. And it seems to me that anybody who has any kind of real grasp of any scientific inquiry, like, I don't know how they come away with that with more questions rather than less, right? Like it seems to me that it doesn't explain why, it doesn't explain anything. It just, you have described it, but you haven't explained it, right? So it seems to me that like genuine inquiry into the complete mystery that is our natural world, being, consciousness, all of it, would make anybody at least religiously minded. It always surprises me that we present that as an either or, because it seems obvious to me that a sincere scientific inquiry would leave a lot of people with at least an appreciation for the unexplained. That might be a good, because I love that you mentioned that about Moses and seeing the face of God, and it made me think of the Jewish tradition of not saying the name of God, or when they spell it out, G-D, they won't spell it out. He who must not be named. And it might actually weirdly be related to the thing that caused me to reach out to you this most recent time, which was the discussion about institution building and sort of organizational health, and how do you create things, how do you protect them, how do you nurture them, how do you how do you help them thrive? Because I think there's a connection here. We have this instinct to want, well, we want to know the founder of things, right? We need to personify, who was, Elon Musk is Tesla. Well, actually turns out Tesla existed before he came along, and actually there was another guy that he ended up kind of having to force out. He bought him out, like the right. But no, he personifies Tesla, right? And if he ends up personifying Twitter, well, that's problematic for a whole lot of people because he's problematic. Right? We do this thing where we need to know who's behind this, and we need to know what their intentions are, right? And so forth. And I'm not arguing with any of that. I think that's deeply human, a human instinct. And I would say if you're going to try to do anything, the first thing, your first condition has to be something like you have to be trying to make things better somehow. You have to at least believe that you are trying to make things better. So that's the old men planting trees thing, right? But you also have to kind of be willing, and this, I think you're halfway there with your estuary project, right? Because you're saying, look, I'm not starting Estuary Inc. And right, you're very clear about that. That was our woodshed conversation. It turns out almost sort of accidentally, I've spent most of my life starting things, businesses and nonprofits, and started a lot of them by now, and still doing it. Something about it I just love doing. And my first business, I guess, was, I started a little lawn mowing business when I was 15. Then when I was in college, I started a house painting business, painted about 150 houses in 2 summers. So it was like a real thing. I didn't really make any money, but I learned a lot. And then over time, I started a number of businesses. Some of them have worked out, and then started nonprofits. And one of the things I'm not exactly sure where I first started having this instinct, but my instinct was, if you want something to actually exist beyond your lifetime, then you have to be willing to let go of any of the potential rewards you might get for having started it, right? So that's, obviously financial, but it's also status, reputation, the sort of attaboys that you might get. Not only do you have to not be seeking that, you almost have to overtly avoid it. Because we're such social creatures, and we're so tuned to what people's motives are. It's kind of like that. What is it about giving your alms publicly?
Don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing.
Right. And the one who prays in public, he has his reward. I'm going to botch it. Here I am.
Well, that's why I already botched. I lost my jewel in my crown when I mentioned I have to take Freddie to the regional transit place to get him 3 more months of bus pass.
Yeah, and something told in secret be shouted from the house. Like these paradoxes. I'm sure that somehow worked its way into my consciousness, because I'm certainly not presenting myself, one, as an expert on this, or that I'm somehow so noble that I'm not not susceptible to the same desires that everyone else has. It's more just a kind of an instinct. It's a reflex. It's to fight it, right? And so whenever I remember one of the things, there's a great biography about George Washington that came out maybe 15 years ago. I forget. It's one of the big biographers who did it. I can't think of the name of him right now, but one of them that has written a lot of great biographies, and I love biographies. But one of the things about him that was so interesting is how assiduously he cultivated the reluctant leader posture. So like he would go out of his way to avoid. So like when the Constitutional Congress is meeting, and he just would happen to show up in full military regalia all the time. And there's this point where we need a general, like, well, there's one, but he burned all his diaries. He kind of publicly anyway resisted any idea that he would be the first president. And then of course, famously set the precedent of stepping down after 2 terms. And that's sort of deeply baked into our culture. And some, the first presidential elections, if you even whispered that you were interested in the job, that was almost like an instant disqualification, right? And then of course, modern campaigns, all that has changed. But there's some kind of wisdom in there, right? Which is, as soon as you say you want the job, there's so many ways in which we've already disqualified you for that job. We don't trust you now because we don't know what you're up to. Like, what are you trying to do, right? And so if you actually want to make things better, particularly if you want to do it in a way that will last, you almost have to commit yourself to serving that mission and refusing to benefit from the potential accolades or rewards that might come with it. And so, of course, we're watching this be instrumentalized across every domain, right? That's what, mega churches, and, if you're charismatic, you rent out a space in a strip mall and start a church. And if it goes well, then you can be rich. And it's not fair for me to only identify that, because of course this exists in every domain, right? So it's not unique to churches. But I do think that there's a genuine longing for institutions where, and maybe it's something like a kind of humanist instinct, where you can bring the best of yourself to something that others are doing the same with, and that the sort of the enchantment comes from the shared experience that you create together, or something like that. And so it seems like if you actually want to create something that will last, the half that I challenged you on, that I thought you were missing, was you have to be committed to it being a thing. It has to be a thing. I loved one of the first things you said when I first started watching you was, without individuals, nothing happens. Without institution, nothing lasts, right? And I know you were quoting somebody else. I had never heard it before, and I remembered it ever since. And I thought, well, actually, that's something that I might have at least a little bit of knowledge about and experience about. So perhaps I should introduce the idea of notes for notes to this conversation, right? I've mentioned the fact that I've started a number of businesses and started a number of nonprofits, and one in particular that comes, there's a couple that come to mind when we're talking about this particular subject. So for me, it began when I was a freshman in college, and I right after freshman orientation, there was a neighborhood school a couple blocks away, and I went and volunteered there to do some tutoring, which makes me sound way more altruistic than I remember being. So there must have been a girl involved or something. I don't remember, right? But I was doing basic reading and math for third and fourth graders. And so I'd go there like every Tuesday afternoon or whatever. And it was close. I just walked to the campus. And then somehow I got connected to the Big Brother, Big Sister program. And I ended up with a little brother. His name was Ricardo. He was a little Black Puerto Rican kid. And, you know, kind of typical sort of leafy campus surrounded by a lot of urban poverty and a lot of stuff going on at home, bad situations for him. And so we would just, I'd walk back to the campus with him and we'd play hacky sack, hang out. You know, like, you know, most of the guys in the quad would just sort of adopt him and we just hung out. We didn't do anything really, right? And then if, I don't know, after a couple months of this, one day I go to pick him up and the teacher pulls me aside and says, he beat up a girl today. You know, can you talk to him? And I still remember it. I'm like, I'm this 18-year-old kid from California. Like, what do you mean? Can I talk to him? Like, you're the adult here. You're the expert. What do you think I'm going to say? Right. And I must have said something like that. And she goes, well, he listens to you. And I'm like, well, I instantly had the thought, well, the only reason he listens to me is because I don't talk to him like that. Right. That was just like my first thought, because I know what I was doing. We were just hanging out.
Child
right?
of the 60s.
Totally. And so, but I remember as we're walking back to campus, you know, like now I have some responsibility. And so I said, I hear you, you know, beat up a girl today. And he's like, the best I could come up with, you know, you never put this in the manual, but I said, well, you know, next time you're going to beat somebody up, at least pick on somebody who could fight back. You know, so that was my sort of, you know, like, you know, Mark Twain wisdom for you, right? But as this is happening, I have this thought, which is like, oh, like our worlds are so far apart. Like here I am, this kid from California. I'm gonna, you know, do my little part to make the world better. Look at me, you know, being whatever, right? And here's this kid whose life is so different from mine. You know, there was poverty and domestic violence and substance abuse, and I remember feeling so limited in what I could do. Like I didn't have a language even to sort of bridge those worlds, right? And then I had, because I grew up around music and my mom was a music teacher later in her life, and music was kind of everywhere in my life, and a big effect on me in high school. Had some real shaping experiences, singing in choir and things like that. And I thought, you know, it'd be like Big Brother, Big Sister, but with music, right? Because there's something about music when you're creating it together, you're forming a bond that you don't have to use words to form. And I think that theme might keep reoccurring here, right? Like we don't have to talk to feel connected to each other. And there's something that happens when you're just together, where you're shaping each other, but you're not, you know, you don't feel the fingerprints, right? You're just affecting each other. And so I had this idea, which is like, wow, you know, wouldn't it be cool to have something like that, but with music? So sort of a music mentorship kind of program. And because I never do anything quickly, 20 years went by. I mean, I got a lot of ideas. I'm not going to get to all of them, right? But I was just, you know, and in a sense, part of the reason I tell this story this way is because of a point I'm going to get to here, right? Which is, if it's a good idea, then the time will come, right? It's like a seed, right, to be planted. And 20 years later, now I'm, you know, whatever, 40 or something like that, like late 30s, 40. And I meet a young man he's parking cars at one of the restaurants in town, and he's got a little brother, and he's in the Big Brother Big Sister program just like I was, and he's taken his little brother to the music stores in town. You know, just don't break anything, you know, and they would be kind of cool about it, let him just hang out. And he has the idea, well, how about if I had a little space where I could just do that with my little brother? And he and I meet, and I'm like, wow, that's a lot like an idea that I've had for years. And so I remember taking him to lunch, and it's part of our sort of lore of our company, of our organization, is I said, you know, would you be willing to make this your life's work? He's talking about proposing marriage on the first date, right? Like, don't be that guy. But I was that guy, right? And to his credit, he's like, sure, you know, so we started a nonprofit and just kind of got a group of friends together to be a little bored. And here we are 15 plus years later. And, you know, we're all over the country now. I think we have 25 studios, something like that. And how I ended up first in Nashville was because after establishing a couple in California, we decided to, well, Music City, let's see what we can do. And Nashville's been very good to the program. And the reason I mention this is because the seed of that was the idea that if you create the context under which people can come together, in this case, so yeah, I guess I never really explained what we do. So what we do is we build recording studios and we put them in boys and girls clubs primarily. And the idea behind that is to create a safe space where in this space, whatever's going on out there, whatever colors or hand signs or stripes or whatever violence you're encountering, in this space, you're a musician. And we're going to meet you there, right? And so there's a fundamental belief in the power of music and human connection to transform lives. And that's the heart of the mission. And so I've seen that work, right? I've seen the way something like that moves people and it inspires people and it creates positive stories. I'm not sitting here saying that it's the answer by any means. But one of the things I chose to do from the very beginning is to make sure that my role was completely silent. So I helped form the board and I served as the chair of the board and founder and all that. But my partner, the CEO, like he runs it and it's his organization. And our goal as a board is to protect him and make sure that he can be effective in that role. Not to give him homework assignments, not to meddle, not to intervene, but to really try to create the space in which he can essentially achieve his dream, right? The fact that I had a similar idea is kind of, in a sense, only accidental. Ultimately, this was about helping a young man achieve his dream. And so I guess there's a funny little story that goes with that, which is one of the things we decided to do. And I remember I called like a little retreat. We met in a conference room on a Saturday. We ordered pizza, and it wasn't even a thing yet. Our little board is like, what do we do? What are we doing? It's not even a thing yet. And I wanted to talk. I wanted to kind of talk about the future of the organization. I wanted to talk about culture, because what was informing that was this belief that we talk a lot about scale, and we tend to think about it in terms of technology, software, stuff like that. But how do you scale what is essentially a service, one-to-one, belly-to-belly kind of organization? Well, you scale it through culture. That's how I think anyway. And so I wanted to be very intentional about like getting the right tone, right? And so one of the things we decided was that we weren't going to censor lyrics. A young person comes into an environment, we want it to be a welcoming environment. We didn't want a sign on the door that says all the lists of things you couldn't do. We wanted to say, no, here, you're welcome. And if you've got something on your heart, when you're on the mic, you say what's on your heart. That wasn't licensed to just be disrespectful. That was like, as an artist, when you're on the microphone, you get to say what's on your heart. And we were just worried about like F-bombs and things like that. We weren't really thinking about this, maybe in its fullness, right? But essentially, free speech, right? Freedom of expression. And that was long before we then came to the buckle of the Bible Belt and started, encountering organizations who were youth serving and talking about our ideas around the importance of, giving particularly the most marginalized youth in our country, because we're in some of the most difficult neighborhoods in the country, places like Detroit and Memphis, DC, so the funny part of the story is that we always knew that one of these young people was going to go on to, some kind of fame or stardom, right? That was never the goal ever. We're not trying to create, music stars, but there's just so much talent out there. And so, yeah, very recently, reached #1 on the Billboard charts. Her name is Gail, and she came out of our Nashville program. And her song is ABCDEFU. And anybody who listens to pop music knows exactly the song we're talking about. And she's a sweetheart. She's, you know, she's a wonderful story. And she's been very generous about her experience with the program. And Phil and I are just like, of course we're thrilled for her, right? But you know, this is a perfect example of like, okay, what did we create exactly?
Yep.
And frankly, that's tame by comparison to what the stuff that, you know, obviously hip hop is a big influence in a lot of these young people. And a lot of the things that they have to say are very hard to hear, very hard to hear.
Yeah.
And there's no easy answers. It's not as if we're sure that the right thing to do is to just simply give that a megaphone, but we just feel really strongly that people need to say what's on their heart. And so anyway, that's a thank you for letting me kind of go on about it. But the reason I think it might be relevant to what we're talking about is that I do think we need to start building institutions. I really do. And one of the things that's happened on YouTube is this kind of it's like a celebrity thing that's happened, you know, like we focused on the people who are out saying things. And I'm not sure that in the end is sustainable.
Yeah. I completely agree. And probably my thinking about estuary over the last 3 years has, I can see more of a need for institutional support of it. I'm to the point, you know, in some ways the COVID was easy for me in Living Stones because I couldn't travel because we weren't going to have meetings. And now, you know, we're looking at some Midwest things and then possibly some European things. I've got to get permission from my council. And then Thunder Bay, it looks like is going to happen at a meeting this morning with the Thunder Bay people. And I see, because I live out of an institution and my council, who are my bosses, I mean, they can, that's what John and I talked about. And John, you know, I thought John was quite remarkable in that conversation too, because he said, yeah, you know, it's not inconceivable that University of Toronto could basically put other demands on him. And of course, Jordan Peterson ran into that. And so I completely agree. I've never been an anti-institutional person. I've always been about building platforms and working within institutions. Back to the enchantment, though. I mean, there is a tension between institutions and enchantment because institutions are created to reliably deliver enchantment. And I think Notes for Notes is a terrific example of it, because what's more enchanted than, you know, the creation of music, and especially the creation of good music. And whereas, I mean, music again is one of these funny Pareto principle things. Like, it's not difficult to go out there and find people who can do music. There are lots of people who can do music. But there's this tiny, tiny, tiny little group that in our language we say are special. And so out of how many hundreds or thousands of kids that got into those studios at Notes for Notes, now someone, bang, top of the charts, and we say she's special. I remember hearing, you know, NBA commentators say, you know, this player is special. And it's like, you mean out of the NBA, everyone in the NBA is special. You don't get to the NBA. There are lots of good ball players out there. You know, I remember when my son was like, I want to be an NBA player. And I was a jerk of a father. It's kind of like, yeah, you know, I appreciate the dream, but you're, you know, he was hoping he would at least be as tall as I was, and he didn't get there. So, you know, one of the things that I said to you, and, you know, and I'm still open to that conversation, is, you know, I would rather, well, AA for me is an institution that has certain enchanted qualities by its chaos. And let me, even though I don't go to meetings or anything like that, I am 100% sure, just as in the case of church, that is, if you drop into any meeting, how many dozens of meetings in any significant size city, you drop into a meeting and you sit down and you hear the drunkalogs and you listen to the stories and you meet the people, on one level, it is boring because you're going to hear the same old story again and again and again. And that is exactly the way it is for church. But you'd then have to ask, why are all these tiny little mind-numbing, insane, crazy churches still going? Because it is enchanted. I mean, enchantment is not and this I think is where we bump into science. Enchantment is not a public quality. And, in my rough drafts for Sunday and in my Sunday sermons lately, I've been riffing about miracles. And, part of the reason YouTube is really handy for a pastor, or the media is handy for pastors, I can talk about Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, and I can't talk about dozens of people that I've known in unhappy marriages, but I can talk about them. And we can talk about Tammy Peterson and her miracle. And we can talk about Michaela Peterson and kind of a miracle. Miracles are seldom, again, the public-private thing doesn't really work, but that's sort of where institutions are at. And so for clergy, there's so much. How do you set up this music in a worship service? Remember one pastor, 3 fast, 3 slow, 1 to get ready and 1 to go. Talk about demythologizing church movement in a secret church. 3 fast to get the crowd up and peppy, get them all excited. 3 slow, bring them down, get them introspective, get them in the mood, hit them with the sermon, 1 to get ready, and then 1 to go, get them out the door with the glow.
There's a formula for pop songs, right?
Exactly.
You want a song to hit the top of the charts? Here's how you do it.
Yep. And so, there's sort of a never getting to the bottom of some of these tensions, where we need the institutions that know the formulas. We can talk to Paul Anleitner, who, he was part of the worship pastor. Worship pastors know that better than anyone else. And pastors do too, because if you're really preaching and you've got the congregation or the audience, however you want to pitch it, in your hand, and they've, it's that silent moment that Peterson talks about. You've got their attention, and, you can land the plane, you can make them cry, you can bring them to the front, you can fill the offering plate. I mean, this is what pastors demythologize in order to, once you get to that level, though, suddenly for the pastor, it's the fat phony in the red suit. And, well, isn't it funny that you can pull on this beard and it won't come off? So all of those are there. And, but yet once the owners of the institution no longer believe in the miracle, and that's of course where, what has happened to a lot of churches, a lot of clergy.
And that's just too good an opening for, because one of the things I remember saying to you, I think in our first conversation, and you've always been so generous about these kinds of questions, is, I said something like, Paul, I'm interested in the truth, right? And church is the last place I would go for the truth, right? And what I was saying at the time is, if there are a series of propositions where I must say these propositions, or I'm no longer a member of good standing, or worse, if I'm employed by the organization, I might lose my livelihood. So say these things, And if you don't, you lose all your friends and you lose your livelihood. Oh, well, okay, tell me what to say exactly? Oh, right? I mean, I'm sure there are people who are willing, there were people who burned at the stake because they were unwilling to say certain words, right? So, there obviously are people who care enough about saying what they believe to be true that they're willing to die doing it. Most people say, I want to make sure I say it just right. So tell me exactly what to say, and I'll say those words exactly, because I don't want to, I don't want to be banished. I don't want to lose my job. And so an organization that sets itself up by saying you have to say this in order to be, it seems like it has willfully said we're less interested in the truth than we are in some kind of, right? Now, this is not, my point is not that there isn't some utility in, as John Vervaeke would say, propositional truths, right? That isn't my point. My point is when you make them, doctrine or gospel, or like you must or else, well, then you are overtly communicating that you're no longer interested in what I actually think, right? And it seems to me that that's one of the major shortcomings of many religious institutions. It would be the first thing that I would be looking to see some flexibility around, and maybe that's the point behind Estuary, right? Is at least say, look, it's okay if you have some doubts about this. And most religious people will give at least lip service to the idea of doubt or entertaining doubt, but then go ahead and say, well, actually, no, I don't actually believe this, or I don't believe in the Trinity, or whatever, right? Or I find the whole thing so convoluted as to be, incoherent, or whatever. Well, then you're out, right? And so, and again, this might have to do with my sort of naive idea of what a church is, but I associate it with something like truth seeking, right? It seems like that would be one of the obvious missions of a church, is an honest and comprehensive and sincere pursuit of the truth, wherever it takes us, right? And my sense, anyway, is an institution that was committed to that, and that was probably what got us all so excited about the IDW in its, at its origins, and the comments I was making earlier about institution building is probably why it was such a colossal and embarrassing failure, because there weren't institution builders involved in any of that. But something like an institution that commits itself to the pursuit of the truth, and then to this point we've been making, which is we've got to find some way to actually re-enchant the human experience. Like, human beings are magical. They're miraculous. It's, as many you have said, and many have said, Jordan Peterson said, like, spend a little time and just listen and they will amaze you, right? Like, being itself is incredible. It's an unbelievably mysterious and magical and miraculous thing. Like, how about we start, reminding each other of how amazing and how lucky we are that we're even alive, right? We've talked a little bit about this in other conversations, but how about we start amplifying our heroes? How about we start reminding people of just how many heroes there are? Within a mile of your house, there are heroes. There are people doing unbelievably heroic work of all types. And how about we start telling their stories, for example? One of the ideas behind Nuance Forum, I know that we haven't really talked about that, is besides, an organization committed to facilitating meaningful conversations between people and creating the conditions under which they can do that, is the idea of cultivating young voices. Maybe the first time they've ever been published, give them a chance to write what they think, right? Give them a platform, but also old voices. Like, let's get our octogenarians on and let's hear the lessons that they would want to share if anybody ever cared to listen to them, because they have a lot to say, right? And we might actually benefit from it. it seems like this is doable, right? But anything that says, you know, there's a sign on the door that says here are the things that you have to believe in order to participate. In the same way that a sign on the door that said, you know, you can come in here, but you can't swear and you can't do this and you can't do this, right? It seems like without that, you're not going to create the conditions under which people can actually begin to engage the project meaningfully, I guess.
Yeah. Part of the difficulty with this propositional level is we have overplayed its utility through time. We have failed to understand the nature of the mystery that words are. For example, if someone is a Holocaust denier, well, there's a propositional thing. As a culture, we have sort of said Holocaust deniers shouldn't be on Twitter. Okay, was Elon Musk going to bring Holocaust deniers back to Twitter? Is that a good thing? So I've been, well, I often listen to things when I go to bed, and because there's a certain level of interest for me that puts me to sleep at night. It's very strange. If it's too interesting, I stay awake to listen to it. If it's too boring, I get annoyed and I stay awake. So I've actually found that
we do all the British mysteries. They're perfect for that.
Eusebius is actually very good to fall asleep to. Eusebius is this, you know, is sort of the first church historian, if you don't think about Luke. And Eusebius is just full of martyr stories. People who were told to, you know, well, just don't say that Jesus is Lord. And, you know, you don't even have to believe your words, because, you know, it's kind of a bother to kill all these people. And everybody looks at them and says, they're not really hurting a lot of things actually. But then you have these dramatic stories in Eusebius of, you know, women and little old ladies and, you know, attractive virgins and old men and young men, just, you know, looking the Romans in the eye and saying, Jesus is Lord, stick it in me, you know, just go ahead, dare. And that kind of, you know, that kind of thing is inspiring. But yet you're right. I'm not going to, you know, well, here's the Apostles' Creed. Sign on to the virgin birth and the second coming, or out you go. And, you know, obviously for me, Estuary is an attempt to address this. And part of that for me is also truth telling, because as a pastor, I know that there are lots of people in church that are sort of, well, what do I have to agree to? Well, this right here. And here are these, you know, here's the canons of Dort. Did you ever read it?
They don't even know there's, I was talking to my wife. I got used to saying that since we've talked last, I've gotten married. And I was saying, you know, the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed, she's, what are you even talking about? And so I Google it and I start reading it. And then she just starts completing it for me. It's like, oh, I know that. I'm like, yeah, you said it every Sunday. And she didn't even remember saying it, right?
Exactly.
Whatever meaning it had was immaterial.
So there's definitely this mystery to this question of confession. And then of course there's a developmental aspect to it. You start saying it when you're a kid and you just keep saying it. It's there in your head.
Like the Pledge of Allegiance.
Like the Pledge of Allegiance. So that there's definitely, and I think the church needs to continue, especially Protestant churches, that because of what happened in the Reformation, they tended to major on that. Whereas it seems the Orthodox in some ways are, you know, the main thing is that you participate in the practices, and it will give you more liberty in terms of some of the other things up there, which is sort of coming back around. But your main point, which is the quest for truth, is, well, that's to a degree. So the temple, the art, the altar, all of this was the seed out of which everything grew. And of course, the university was, this is the quest for truth, and we're going to, in fact, pursue truth, pursue truth come what may. And so theology at the end of the 19th century is sort of taken out of university curriculums, and suddenly Yale and Harvard begin to agree with each other. And whereas before they were set up as kind of opponent processing within Protestant spheres. And that's where you get this question of institutions and truth, because not only do we sort of scale up as agents in terms of this great search for truth, which is not only within us, but between us. Institutions also were, Harvard is going to be the voice of this, and Yale is going to be the voice of this. And so maybe now New York Times is the voice of this, and Wall Street Journal is the voice of that. And, you're not going to get the whole truth unless you have both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and all the way around. So that's right. And so then the question is the arena of the church fundamentally a witness to the truth, which is basically one of its functions by its founder, you will be my witnesses? Or is it the forum in which truth is discovered, truth that is both already within the room and truth that is outside of the room? And so there's a lot to this. And the irony has been that there have been many attempts at, my one appearance on Unbelievable it was so funny when Justin called me, says, "Oh, I want you on the show," because he'd talked to me for, I want to get you on the show. I want to get you on the show. Okay, I got you on the show. I'm like, I wonder who I'm going to be talking to. You're going to talk to one of these guys that does the atheist church. And he complains, he says, this should be the time is right for us. This is our moment. And he's like, we got nothing. And then you go to these other dynamics.
He was great, by the way. I remember that. And I actually found him very refreshing.
He was nice, sensational.
Yeah.
And then you look at, you read something like Lyle Schaller. A lot of people outside the church don't have any idea just how intensively the church is studied in terms of statistics, sociology. There's an entire market out there that does nothing but intensively study the church with respect to success and outcomes and all of these sorts of things. It's an enormous thing. And an early guy in that was Lyle Schaller, who very early on said, churches that grow are basically dogmatic and stubborn about countercultural issues. And so,
in other words, political.
What's that?
In other words, political.
Depending on what you mean by political, because polemical.
Okay.
Many of these churches, the relationship between church and politics is very interesting. But let's say even in the middle of the 20th century, look at the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormon Church. Those two groups you wouldn't look at, especially before sort of the rise of social media and the rise of the religious right. When you ask about a political pastor, someone might mention Jerry Falwell. Yeah, the Mormons are reliably conservative, and of course they're really rooting for Mitt Romney. But nobody looks at the Jehovah's Witnesses and say, "Gosh, I can't go to a political convention and not bump into this great number of Jehovah's Witnesses." They're not political.
Yeah, and I got you off your point too, because in a way, the fact that that's so conflated now is also very much a product of the times we're living in too. Yeah.
So this is something that needs to continue to be explored, because on one hand, churches have definitely overplayed the propositional, but I think on the other hand, the interrelationship between the propositional and the arena, the participatory, and all of these things is in fact very complex and has been for a long time.
Well, and people need them is maybe the point you're driving at too, which is that some, I mean, you could say that this, I'm not, this is where my head goes. I'm not comparing them, but you could say that about, say, the QAnon phenomenon, right? It's like, even it can sound absolutely outrageous to anybody outside it, but it's obviously clearly serving some function for the people who are in that space, right? So there's clearly within at least a lot of people, I don't know if it's everyone, but with it, maybe this need for, give me a story that I can believe in. And I definitely don't think the answer is to rip that out of their hands, right? Like, one of my things is I don't argue with a man's religion on his deathbed. I just don't, right? It's like, I take it very seriously because I acknowledge that how important it is.
Well, and it was, and especially in your story, I mean, nothing was more serious for, the group that raised you.
Totally.
And they lived it.
Totally. Yeah.
And
totally.
yet you also saw that, wait a minute. This also can't be right.
I remember they would have what they called give their testimony, in their fellowship meetings on Sunday. And I remember my dad giving his testimony, and this, I'm probably, I don't know, mid-teens, something like that. And it was unusual for him. It was a different kind of, that's part of the reason I think it stood out. He seemed to be in a reflective mood or something. It's all fuzzy, but I remember what he said approximately. And it was something like, even if I discover at the end of my life that there is no heaven and that none of this is true, that alone would be unusual to hear, because he was very devout, very devout. It all still would have been worth it. And to my sort of, adolescent brain, I'm like, you just said something important, right? Maybe that was Pascal's wager. Am I getting that right?
Yeah. I just did a conversation yesterday with a guy whose father was deep into Christian Science, which is kind of another real outpost sect in terms of Christianity. But you're right. And even QAnon, I mean, I would imagine many people you could sit down and say, all right, now come on. That pizza place,
just you and me, just the two of us.
That's right.
Right.
Really?
Yeah.
But and that's the weird thing about us, in that this propositional layer, I don't think is exactly what we think it is.
Yeah. I want to make sure, because we could go on, as you and I both know. I want to make sure I'm respectful of your time. So
you got to be respectful of Freddie's need for a bus pass.
Let you get to Freddie and his bus pass pretty soon here. So we've mentioned Nuance Forum. I've kind of alluded to it. This is another one of these things where I've been thinking about this forever, for years, right? I remember when I came up with a name for it. This is probably 10 years ago. Yeah, it'd be something, nuance, right? And at the time, that wasn't a word people used very much, right? So I figured, is anybody even going to know what I'm talking about? It's just like some personal fragrance or a wine bar or a yoga studio. Like, what is this nuance business? Now, of course, everybody's talking about it, but that's just a testament to how slowly I incubate on things. What does it fail fast? That's the Silicon Valley thing. If whatever that is, I'm the opposite of it. It's like fails really slowly. Don't just think about it, do something. And I'm like, don't do something, think about it.
Burn through years of your life. Go ahead.
Right. But I mean, I'm being kind of aw shucks, golly gee whiz about it, but at some level there actually is a whole sort of thought process behind it. And I think part of it is to this point of more of a planting a seed kind of approach, that if the idea is the right idea and it really will actually make the world better in some way, then all you really have to do is plant it, and then just do the things that make it so it doesn't die. Because there are so many ways in which, particularly at the beginning of something, it just dies. People get discouraged, they burn out, they step on it. It was just a little green, and then somebody steps on it, or they overwater it, or they don't water it at all, or whatever, right? So the metaphor of it, like cultivating, nurturing, protecting, is one that I think is really apt here. And so from my point of view, it's mostly, I just think something like this should exist. That's why I loved hearing you talk about estuary, and some of this is motivated by my own interests. And I know you're not that different. Some of it's just loneliness. Like, where do I go to talk to people who just enjoy these kinds of conversations where you don't, it's not, you don't put a boundary on the conversation. You just kind of let it go where it goes. And you know that you're a good faith interlocutor, and so are they. And so wherever you end up, you trust that something good will come of it, at least aggregated over many iterations over time, right? It's a profoundly relational idea, right? Is that power of relationships. And so, yeah, Nuance Forum is really just, the idea is that something like this should exist, an organization committed to facilitating meaningful conversations across generations, across cultures, right, where people get a chance to say what they think, hear themselves say it, hear other people say what they think, and then facilitate those conversations. And a lot of this, I think, has to be, I like to say belly to belly. It's got to be in person. It's got to be around a dinner table. Perhaps there are musicians there playing. Perhaps there's an artist. Perhaps around an art gallery, or there's a lecture. Ways to stimulate thought and conversation, but all with this deeply relational model, which is that first and foremost that there's some genuine joy in being able to come together, break bread, and learn from each other, right? So that's kind of the core idea. And so most of that is offline, most of that doesn't scale. But what I think does scale, kind of to my earlier point about culture, is that we need models. We need to see what this looks like. Like, if you turn on a screen of any kind, where do you go to find examples of people relating to each other in good faith, with warmth, and Ivan Illich's conviviality, tools for conviviality, this idea of convivial spaces where we intentionally create them so that we can do that. And anyway, so this is just one attempt at that is born out of my own interest in being able to pursue these things more deeply. And so we started, just about the time we started having our little meetups. And by the way, thank you to you. You mentioned it at one point, and some folks here in Nashville showed up. So we have all these great musicians and folks who sort of gathered around this idea. And then out of this, a new nonprofit has also formed, Pitch Music, which is essentially a way for singer-songwriters to, every Tuesday night in Nashville, they can come and show their stuff and be backed up by a professional touring band. And that was a result of the relationships that formed. And I had some background in helping nonprofits get started, so we just started it. So a business is forming out of another relationship. So there's all these sort of cool things that come out of this, and that's kind of just more my motivation, frankly. Like the idea that we're going to conquer the internet or something, like no. Not interested in that. But one of our early conversations was with Brittany King, who was a former Black Lives Matter organizer in Columbus, Indiana, home of Mike Pence. And as she likes to tell, she says, a city of like 45,000 people, there's probably like 1,800 Black folks. So she grew up very much like often the only Black kid in an all-white classroom, and had that kind of experience of being a Black American, and then went off to NYU and ended up studying with Ta-Nehisi Coates, and kind of started encountering the Glenn Lowrys and the Coleman Hugheses of the world, and started to rethink her own thinking, and went through this whole journey of critical analysis, and eventually stepped away from BLM, and we became friends. She came on our little program, and we had this great conversation, and then over the course of a year and a half, we just ended up, 3 or 4 hour conversations of many of those. And so it decided to start working together. And so where we're starting with it is, and this is kind of her brainchild, is to launch a publication that I alluded to a minute ago. This is her idea. She's calling it Yellow Seeds. She happens to be a believing Christian, so you can sort of see where she came up with that idea. But with the specific idea of giving a platform to voices that may have something to say and maybe never have been published. In some cases, obviously, they will have. Our very first piece was Chloe Valdery. She did a really nice piece for us, specifically on the subject of nuance, and just nailed it, like just absolutely nailed, like a muscular kind of nuance, like a deep, rich, like as I said to her, you got the nuance of nuance, right? Like she understood why that is so important, right? That you engage more deeply, you take on some of the layers. So we will have some people like that have more of a following, but the idea is to give people a chance to, what I've been encouraging is no polemics. We're not here to just rant or make your best argument. It's more like, if we're arguing about it in public, that means there's something at stake, right? Okay, so what's at stake? Try to illuminate what's the internal tension within the subject. Like you've got your side, you're going to make your points, they're going to make their points. Perhaps the argument itself is the point, right? Like there's something happening there where we've decided that this is worth arguing about. Okay, well, what's at stake here? Obviously, if we're angry or we're heated or we're feeling, we're upset, and chances are that's a fear response. That means we feel threatened somehow. Like, okay, so what's at stake, right? And so the goal is to present pieces that kind of try to highlight what is at stake here. What are the internal tensions within the particular subject that's being written about. And then the whole idea is, and then have some of them come on and engage in conversation. So the whole idea is to ultimately lead to conversations. And as you know, our little tagline is the satisfying conversation. Like, when was the last time you had a satisfying conversation, right? And the whole idea there is that if you're going to have a satisfying conversation, you kind of have to be committed to the other person having a satisfying conversation. Otherwise, it's just not very satisfying, right? Yep. And on the other hand, if it isn't about something that's at least kind of important, if it's just small talk, well, that's not very satisfying either, because there's nothing really at stake, right? So that seems to be that there has to be something at stake, and you have to take it seriously, but you also have to make sure you have to be committed to the other person having a good experience as well. So that means no trolling, avoid the snark as much as possible, avoid mocking, avoid sarcasm, like all the things that degrade or diminish or belittle, like those are not helpful. That if anything, I think that may be where we all end up, is the recognition is how much damage we're doing by all the dunks and all the ways in which we're deglossing each other. So that's the core idea. And I love the fact that, an old white guy and a younger Black woman can come together, and we're blending our cultures, and we'll see. I mean, it's an experiment. We're gonna give it a go and see how it goes. So that's kind of the next iteration of Nuance Forum. But long term, it's events. We're going to be remodeling our house with a specific idea of creating a space where we can actually have these kinds of events and have dinners and have art openings and have musicians play, and with the same idea. So it's very much a long-term project. And some of these lend themselves to bringing a camera in and sharing it with the world. And some of them, it's just about building relationships.
I think that's tremendous. And it's funny how, there's so much space. People don't. So if you look at church history, people looking back through the years will just imagine, oh, Paul went to all of these places and planted churches. And, we asked about this question about how can a church die? And what do we mean by this word and all of this? If you read church history, even if you just read just the tiny little sample that's preserved in the New Testament of very early churches, it's very hard to try to get an understanding of just how chaotic, just how diverse, just how minimal a lot of things were in those places. The church at Corinth, the church at Laodicea, the church at Philippi, the church at Ephesus. It's tremendously chaotic. And actually the first name of churches was the church in Laodicea, the church in Philippi, the church in Ephesus. It wasn't the church that's in all of these different places. It's just, this is the church here, this is the church there. And of course, church just means gathering in Greek. So the group there, the group there, the group there, the group there. And, one of the things that you and I have talked quite a bit about is the difficulty in scaling. Because I think part of what we struggle with is the recognition that, life is short. And, even with the groups that, the network that your family of origin was a part of. And you've shared stories too. I mean, part of it's one thing if it's sort of dad and mom and uncle and just our little local group, but almost right away, because we're, as human beings, we're all centers of the world, and there's a world out there that we know as a center that is not us. And the connection between those 2 points. So it's going to be very interesting as this need, when I look at Nuance Forum and when I think about estuary, and when I look at, so I was, talked to this morning with Peugeot a little bit about, so he's got the symbolic world, and Vervaeke has the religion that's not a religion, and Sevilla is studying Persig, and of course there's churches, and to me it's clear that bigger things sort of go through the culture. And I don't see Nuance Forum or estuary in any kind, and I know you feel the same way. We don't feel like we're competitors at all in this, because my goodness, the world is so huge.
Yeah, we're gonna boil the ocean, like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we're just.
I want to say a little bit more about that scaling thing, because it's so salient to this conversation, and that is, I remember the early days with Notes for Notes when we were first starting, and we're thinking like, how on earth can we scale this? And I had served with a number of like grant giving nonprofits where you're sort of trying to evaluate like reach, impact, how many youth served, these kinds of metrics that are often used in that setting. And here you have a small space, our very first studio was tiny. It was like 2 rooms, basically. Now they're like 800 or 900 square feet. They're like 5 rooms with a podcast station and a stage. I mean, it's pretty, but at the beginning it was really small. And like, how on earth, and you know what little kids like the most? They like drums. They really like to bang on things, right? And particularly drums, right? And the other things they like to do is they like to like sing along to Beyonce on YouTube or whatever. So like the little kids in particular, they just like to make noise, right? And meanwhile, it's also a recording studio. Like, wait a minute, how's this work? What? Right? So, we knew when we started that we were doing something essentially the way, you would use that word, unscalable, right? And I would say overtly, like, there's no way you can scale this, right? The best you can hope for is you might serve a dozen, 15 youth over a course of, from the end of school day to like 7 o'clock at night or whatever. It's an after school program. But 15 years later, one of those youth is being interviewed by everybody. She's on the, Tonight Show, and she's talking about this program that was hugely influential to her development as a young person, as an artist, and she ends up at the top of the Billboard charts. So did it scale or not? Right? So, right, and that idea of thinking about scale in terms of a culture that finds its way out there and sheds light, or that brings a little joy or a little connection, right, is a different way of thinking about scale. But I'm absolutely convinced, and it's great to tell the story now, because at the time I had nothing to show for it. I was like, I think the way you scale this is culture. Most of the people who support what we're doing will never step foot in a studio, or maybe once for a tour, right? But they care about what's happening in there, and they want it to continue, right? And so the challenge is to find ways, and this is one of the great things about technology, is that we can share what's happening, right? We can find ways to through video, or obviously through recording, to tell the stories of some of these young people and these artists that are coming through and the ways that it's impacting their lives. And so that is a form of scale, right? So anyway, I do think that if you get it right, then it grows into a tree, right? And there's your scale, basically.
Yeah. And I agree. I agree 100%. It's the culture. And, you know, now to proliferate words a little bit, what is that which creates the culture? In a sense, it's the spirit. There's a spirit. There was a spirit of Notes for Notes that was right there in that first thing that sort of began to create other things. And what's interesting is that I would imagine that I don't know what language you use, but every single instance of Notes for Notes in different cities in the country, they're all unique too.
Totally.
And yet they share a culture.
Yep.
And they're always, in some ways, there's always some tension. There's some tension between the local instantiation and the overall culture. And it's actually in some of that tension that you get the uniqueness. And sometimes that creates problems, and sometimes it'll kill something, because we have this with church all the time. And and the first thing that we talked about when we first started comparing notes between Notes for Notes and church planting is how much of these dynamics really hold true.
And how many times, and how many times when you're trying to start something, how many times someone will come along right there at the beginning to try to stop it. It's almost like human beings, obviously not everyone, but there's certain people almost reflexively, like an allergic reaction to try to stop something new. And I've just seen that over and over and over again. So there is something about when you start something, you got to make sure that it survives. Like, in a sense, that's the most important thing you do in the earliest stages, is like, wait a minute, is that still around? Actually, so yes, it is, right? And what it takes to keep something alive at the beginning is next to nothing. And so there's so much of the time, there's all this huge investment of resources and time and capital in some cases. And then the whole thing flames out because, of course, it didn't get traction, right? So it flames out and it never becomes what it maybe ultimately could become.
Someone's trying to get in my door, which is fine. I'm sure they're fine. But you're exactly right. And hang on a second.
Yeah,
hang
go
on
ahead,
a second, and then I'll just check who this is.
Okay.
And, let's see if I get this right. And I think this is, I mean, the point you just made, I think, is exactly part of why we found each other, because I agree completely with that strategy, because one of the things that you protect things from when you don't sort of begin necessarily with, we're going to start a coffee shop and we're going to put, you know, there's going to be one on how many important corners in this city. When you start with something and say, we're going to let this one thing grow and we're going to protect it. And part of that tinkering, that fastidiousness on the one thing is, in fact, whether people use those words or not, tuning the culture. It's all these little decisions. Yeah, we're going to talk about this. We're not going to talk about that. Well, why? I don't really know. But I've had enough experience to know if we go there, that's not where I want to be. I want to go over here. And it's all those tiny little things. And then, of course, when you're doing it with other people, it's all of the people tinkering with the knobs, and nobody's on the same page, and some will drop out. But that's exactly right. And that's, you know, what happens with every church that starts and survives, that even if they're weird, and even if they're wrong, and even if they're unhealthy in how many different ways, if they're still surviving, well, there's something there. There's something there that's worth that's worth keeping in existence for some reason.
I'm going to let you go, but I want to share a story before I do. First of all, the one thing that could come out of this, there might be some other people in Nashville who would like to be part of our little group. So maybe we should let them know that they're welcome. We have a YouTube channel. We've got some, you know, we have a website. We have a few things like that, but we're not trying that hard in the internet space, but we're sort of out there. there'll be more coming over time. But I wanted to tell you a story. You remember I said at the beginning, sometimes you don't really know why you're interested in something. I know you've done this because you've mentioned it, where you sort of just go down this rabbit hole and you'll just kind of like, for whatever reason, something will catch your interest and then you'll just kind of learn everything you can learn about it, right? And so I've had that same experience many times in my life. So I know exactly what you're talking about. With that in mind, there have been many times where I'm like, what exactly am I doing? Like, why am I watching this guy? And Jordan Peterson to some extent is, as we say, mapped territory for me. I remember when I found him and found him very interesting. And I was watching the sort of phenomenon as an observer of the phenomenon, and just had very strong instincts. This something is going to burn out. It's burning way too hot, right? He would even kind of drop references about that in his own interviews sometimes. Like he even seemed to have a sense that he was flying too close to the sun. But why am I watching this pastor in Sacramento, California? And why am I interested in this exactly? Because like most of the theology, I'm kind of eye rolling my way through a lot of it. A lot of people care a lot about this stuff, and there's a lot of arguments about it. I don't get it. I don't get why people argue about it. Well, so I'm the youngest of 4 children, and my mother died last summer. And I had not, there's 2 girls and 2 boys, girl, boy, boy is the order. I had not talked to my brother in 12 years. And I don't know why. I still don't know why. We never had an argument. Just suddenly there was a point where calls weren't returned and texts, and at some point just kind of stopped communicating. We shared a room from the time I was born to the time he left home for college, so 16 years. Shared everything. We were closest 2 years apart. And I wouldn't be surprised if he watches this, actually. I'll explain in a second why. So after the funeral, we all met back at the house, and there was some conversations about, practicalities. And we're there in the living room. My father died back in 2006, I guess it was. So he'd been long gone. But there were his Bibles still next to where he always sat, and these end tables that he had built himself, and they were cool because you could open them, and there was a bunch more room for a bunch more books, right? So we're kind of opening them up, and my brother he opens it up, and there's these like concordances and all these other books, and right, different translations of the Bible. And then here's this book, the Book of Enoch. And I had just heard a conversation. Jordan Peterson had interviewed that guy about the immortality key guy, I think it was, right? And it was just like a kind of a psychedelic, literally, conversation, right?
Yeah.
And and I didn't really know anything about the Book of Enoch, which is now funny how it's now kind of emerged in other ways in the conversation.
Yeah.
But I knew enough that it was like, kind of apocryphal. It was like, it wasn't part of the Bible, but and I'm like, Dad, like I had no idea you were reading the Book of Enoch, right? Like, because he was pretty doctrinaire, like, and so I make some comment to Dan, and I say, well, I was just watching this interview. Like, I had no idea Dad was interested in this kind of stuff. I was just watching this interview with Jordan Peterson about, like, those early days of the church, or like, there's some very interesting things happening. Like, I found the whole thing quite engrossing, to sort of the machinations of the different forces and the different beliefs and the Gnostics, and right. And so I'm talking like that. And like, I had no idea Dad was interested in this kind of stuff. I just always sort of saw him as very, very fundamentalist and very, kind of doctrinaire. And so my brother says, Jordan Peterson, yeah, I know about him. And then he says, yeah, and there's this guy in Sacramento, like a pastor. I'm like, yeah, Paul Vanderklay. and he mentions Jordan Peterson, and I said, yeah, I know Paul. He's from around here. We were actually in Douglas, near Whitensville, where my mom lived. And he says, yeah, Jordan Peterson, I hope I quote him correctly. He just got quiet and he said, that man helped me through a really dark time. I said, well, I actually talked to Paul here and there, and I sent him our little conversation that we had a while back. And so every once in a while, he'll text me now and he'll say, so when are you going to talk to Paul again? Right. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if he ends up watching this. So there you go. There's a little enchantment for you. Why on earth have I devoted? I mean, you've devoted as much time as you've devoted to making these videos. Why have I devoted so much time to watching them? I can't answer that, but now I can. So suddenly he and I had a vocabulary. We had a language that we shared 12 years without talking. And it was like we never missed a step. So now we had something to talk about.
We do think of ourselves as little centers of the universe, but so Mary, Mary Cohen, Mary's been, I got to be careful here because Mary's had some health issues, and so she hasn't been on the internet much, but she emails me and she texts me and she's the way she is. I mean, she's very energetic. She's very insistent. And so one of the things that she said is, when I'm feeling like I can do a Zoom or a YouTube thing again, Paul, you and I have to talk. Okay, Mary, what do we have to talk about? This whole enchantment business, everybody's getting it wrong. It's not like we have to enchant the world. It's already enchanted. Why are people talking that way? Why don't we just open our eyes to the reality that it is enchanted? And why are we so blind? And that's, of course, Mary comes at you. She's a force of nature. And I said, Mary, when you're ready to be back on YouTube and back on the internet, I will clear my calendar and you can tell that to the world. So
for 2.5 hours into this conversation, almost nobody will hear this, but only the real diehards, but maybe my brother will. And in a sense, there's gratitude in what I'm saying, because I know the dedication that you've had to have just to do the work you're doing, but more importantly, your openness and your heart. And I know you don't exactly know where you're going with this, but you're still at it. So God bless you for that.
Well, thank you. And I was talking to David Fuller, and I was participating in one of his campfire things out there with Rebel Wisdom. Not out there, I was doing it from here, obviously, but he said, well, you're the most, what word did he use? I forget, but basically,
you mentioned it. Your not endurance,
stamina.
That's the word.
That's a good word for an aging middle-aged man that he likes to hear he still has.
As your T levels drop, it's always good to be reminded.
That's right. Stamina. And for me, there's something in each of us that's driving us in ways that we don't understand. We don't understand ourselves. And whether it's, your father reading the book of Enoch, or you listen to crazy Dutch Reformed pastor from Sacramento, or me, I regularly get comments. One guy just recently, he's just like, why don't you just take the magic mushroom and be done with it? It's like, well, I don't want to be done with it. I want to know. And, I had a person recently, we were messaging back and forth, and he messaged me. He said, I so desperately want to believe. And I told him, I said, I will pray for you daily. And I have, and so it sounds like a strange thing for me, I'm a minister. Yeah, this whole propositional thing, I believe I can check off the boxes, and I do it in a clear conscience. I don't feel self-conflicted about those things at all in terms of the church. Yeah, I believe all these things. That there's no question in my mind. Yet, I also have the sense that I don't believe them near enough. And even describing what on earth that means isn't easy, because I have the sense that, I, like Peter, on one hand, look at Jesus walking on water and say, bid me to come. And he says, come. But I look at the wind and the waves, and, I start to sink. And so then you cry out, save me. And Jesus doesn't give an attaboy. He says, oh, Peter, come on. You have little faith. Why did you look down? Why didn't you keep believing? And so
It only works if you believe it.
yeah. And that's my quest too. And I also, and I also, I have fun with Freddie. We talked about Freddie a little bit. I have fun with Freddie, but he'll, often, I'm his pastor, and then he'll ask me a soul searching question, basically, why am I the way I am? And why is the world the way it is? And I very much want to say, Freddie, I would love to just speak a word, and whatever it is that you're struggling with in yourself, to just dispel it. I would love to do that for you. And so I will pray, and, I will love, and I will trust, and I'll do all those things. But, there still is an enchantment that I think we all long for. And we long to have it touch down. And, I think about one of my favorite Peterson moments on YouTube was his conversation with Peugeot, where Jordan is just basically, saying, can the story verse and the physical verse, can they touch? And so, no, and I still long for that day.
I told Jonathan that was a masterful, the way he handled that conversation.
Yeah.
It was like, better than a lot of pastors I know.
Yep. No, absolutely. Absolutely.
Really, the grace in that conversation was beautiful.
Yes. Well, we should land the plane here. I got someone waiting in the parking lot for me. I got Freddie waiting for a bus pass. I got other members of the church who are stacked up on my voicemail. So,
well, it's wonderful to catch up with you, Paul.
Yeah,
and
Rod,
obviously we'll keep each other up to date.
Yes, we will. All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.